The alarms screamed through the monitoring station like angry metal birds. Commander Vex Thorn ran his 4 hands over the control panels while his cybernetic eyes processed data streams that made no sense. The quantum signature was impossible. It matched Earth technology, but Earth was dead. Everyone knew that story. The Devourers had eaten the blue planet 300 years ago. Turning it into cosmic dust and broken dreams, Vex stared at the readings again. His people, the Altarians, had fought in 1,000 wars across the galaxy. They knew the signatures of every known ship design. This was definitely human, but humans were extinct. The last colony ships had been hunted down decades ago by various species who saw them as dangerous refugees. Nobody wanted the survivors of a dead world bringing their problems to peaceful systems. The transmission came through on old Earth frequencies that hadn't been used since the planet burned. Static filled with voices speaking in languages the galactic translator struggled to understand. Then came a clear message in perfect galactic standard. "This is the UES Prometheus requesting docking clearance at Kepler Station." Vex felt his secondary heart skip beats. The Prometheus was legend, one of 12 deep exploration vessels that had vanished into the galactic void years before Earth's destruction. Most beings assumed they had died in the darkness between stars, their crews turning to dust while searching for new homes that would never welcome them. Admiral Kress received the emergency transmission while reviewing trade reports in his office. Aboard the Centauri Defense Fleet's flagship. The Centauri were practical people who had built their empire through careful planning and avoiding unnecessary conflicts. They had watched Earth burn from a safe distance, then helped clean up the debris field for valuable resources. The Admiral's pale blue skin shifted to darker shades as he processed the information. His species changed color with emotional states, and right now he was experiencing something between confusion and fear. The message was clear. A human ship was approaching the Kepler system, and it was very much alive. "Sir," his communications officer reported, "the ship is broadcasting on all frequencies. Every listening post within 50 light-years is picking up the signal." Admiral Kress stood from his chair and walked to the tactical display. The Prometheus appeared as a dark shape moving through space at speeds that should have been impossible for a ship of its age. Human technology had always been primitive compared to other species. They relied on crude fusion drives and basic shield systems. Yet this ship was moving like it had access to quantum displacement technology that only the most advanced races possessed. On the bridge of the approaching vessel, Captain Rex Morgan studied the alien structures growing larger on his main screen. 3 centuries in deep space had changed him and his crew in ways the galaxy wasn't prepared to understand. His body still looked human, but bio-neural implants threaded through his brain like silver lightning. His thoughts moved faster than normal human consciousness, processing information at speeds that would have killed an unmodified mind. The ship around him was no longer purely mechanical. Walls pulsed with organic rhythms while quantum processors hummed with something that felt almost like breathing. The Prometheus had become a living thing during its long journey through the void, its systems evolving and adapting in ways its original designers never imagined. Dr. Elena Vasquez monitored readings from the consciousness drive, a technology they had discovered in the ruins of a dead civilization at the galaxy's edge. The drive tapped directly into the quantum field that connected all living minds, allowing manipulation of thought and memory across vast distances. Her modified nervous system interfaced directly with the ship's bio-neural networks, making her more machine than human in many ways. "Captain," she reported without moving her lips. Her thoughts transmitted directly through the ship's communication system. "They're scanning us with primitive sensors. The readings they're getting won't make sense to them." Morgan smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. His crew had spent 300 years preparing for this moment. While the galaxy celebrated Earth's destruction and divided up human territory, the Prometheus had been learning. They had visited the ruins of extinct civilizations, studied technologies that predated most current species, and discovered truths about consciousness and reality that would terrify anyone who understood them. Let them scan, Morgan said aloud, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to come from the ship itself. They won't understand what they're looking at until we want them to. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session as reports flooded in from across known space. Representatives from dozens of species gathered in the Great Chamber on Nexus Station, their various forms of communication creating a cacophony of concern. The return of a human ship was more than unusual. It was potentially catastrophic. Council Speaker Zen Cardaxis, whose crystalline body had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations for thousands of years, felt something stirring in the quantum fields around the station. His species was naturally sensitive to consciousness fluctuations, and what he sensed from the approaching human vessel made his crystalline structure vibrate with unease. The Vorthak delegation shifted nervously on their multiple legs. Their race had been the ones to sell Earth's location to the Devourers in exchange for safe passage through Devourer territory. They had profited handsomely from humanity's destruction, establishing new trade routes through the former human colonies. The return of any human vessel threatened those profits and possibly their lives. "The ship is broadcasting a message," announced the Council's communications specialist, a hegemony official whose gray skin reflected the chamber's lights. "It's being transmitted to every inhabited system within 50 light-years." The message appeared on screens throughout the chamber in dozens of languages simultaneously. The translation technology struggled with some of the concepts, but the meaning was clear enough to send waves of fear through the assembled representatives. "People of the galaxy," the message began in Captain Morgan's voice, though it seemed to carry echoes of thousands of other human voices. "This is Captain Rex Morgan of the UES Prometheus. 300 years ago you watched our world burn. You stood by while the Devourers consumed everything we held dear. Some of you even helped them find us." The Vorthak delegation tried to leave the chamber, but found the doors sealed by Council security protocols. Their selling of Earth's coordinates was public record, though most preferred not to discuss it. "You thought humanity was extinct," the message continued. "You divided our territories, claimed our resources, and erased our history from your databases. You celebrated our destruction because you feared what we might become if we survived." The transmission quality improved as the Prometheus drew closer to inhabited space. Captain Morgan's image appeared on the screens, but something was wrong with it. His face seemed to shift between different human features as if the transmission was carrying the genetic memories of his entire species. "You were right to fear us," Morgan said, and now his voice definitely carried the harmonics of other speakers, men and women and children who had died when Earth burned. "We have returned, we have evolved, and we remember everything." The message ended, but the quantum echoes continued to pulse through the council chamber. Several representatives from psychically sensitive species reported feeling phantom memories that weren't their own images of Earth's blue skies, human cities, and the final moments when the Devourers began their feast. Admiral Kress received new orders from the Centauri High Command: intercept the Prometheus and determine its capabilities. His fleet moved to surround the human vessel as it entered the outer system, but something felt wrong about the entire situation. The ship wasn't trying to hide or run. It was broadcasting its location to anyone who cared to listen, almost as if it wanted to be found. Captain Morgan stood before his ship's tactical display, watching the alien fleets converge on his position. His crew of 2,000 humans moved through the ship's corridors like ghosts, their consciousness partially merged with the vessel's bioneural systems. They were no longer entirely individual beings, but components of something larger and infinitely more dangerous. "Sir," Dr. Vasquez reported, her thoughts flowing directly into his mind, "the alien fleets are taking standard defensive positions. They're treating us like a conventional threat." Morgan's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed to catch light in impossible ways. "They have no idea what they're dealing with." Begin Phase 1. Throughout the ship, systems that had no names in any galactic language began to activate. The Prometheus had learned much during its journey through the cosmic dark, and now it was time to share that knowledge with the beings who had abandoned humanity to its fate. The Prometheus moved through space like a dark omen, its hull absorbing light in ways that hurt to look at directly. Admiral Kress watched from his command bridge, as his fleet's most powerful sensors tried to penetrate the human ship's defenses. The readings made no sense. The vessel appeared to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, its quantum signature shifting between states that should have been mutually exclusive. Captain Morgan walked through corridors that pulsed with organic rhythms, his footsteps echoing in harmonics that seemed to come from the ship's living walls. The Prometheus had become something far beyond its original design during 3 centuries of evolution in deep space. Its bio-neural network stretched throughout every deck, creating a consciousness that was both ship and crew, human, and something entirely new. Genesis, he spoke to the ship's AI, though the term no longer applied to what the system had become. Begin consciousness deployment. The voice that answered seemed to come from everywhere at once, carrying tones of every human who had ever lived. Consciousness seeds deploying, Captain. Target: all sentient minds within the local galactic cluster. Estimated time to network establishment, 47 minutes. Dr. Elena Vasquez monitored the quantum consciousness field from her station deep within the ship's bio-neural core. Her body was connected to the vessel through dozens of neural interfaces that allowed her thoughts to merge with its vast computational systems. The technology they used had been discovered in the ruins of a civilization that had transcended physical existence millions of years ago, leaving behind only whispers of knowledge in quantum foam. The field is expanding exponentially, she reported through direct thought transmission. We're reaching minds across 17 systems simultaneously. The neural resonance is perfect. On Nexus Station, Council Speaker Zen Cardaxis felt the first touch of alien consciousness brushing against his crystalline thought patterns. His species had evolved natural psychic defenses over millennia. But what was happening now bypassed every protection his people had developed. Something was inserting itself into his mind, carrying with it memories that belonged to another species entirely. He saw blue skies. He felt warm sunlight on skin he didn't possess. He experienced the joy of human children playing in parks that had been reduced to cosmic dust 3 centuries ago. The memories weren't his own, but they felt completely real. More than real, they felt like the most important experiences of his existence. Admiral Kress received emergency reports from across his fleet as crew members began experiencing similar phenomena. Centauri officers found themselves remembering human lives they had never lived. Engineers reported feeling emotional connections to a dead planet they had never seen. The ship's psychologists were overwhelmed by requests for help from personnel, who couldn't distinguish between their own memories and the alien experiences flooding their minds. Sir, his communications officer reported, her pale blue skin now showing stress patterns of deep purple, we're receiving similar reports from every ship in the fleet. Something is happening to our crews on a neurological level. The Vorthic trade delegation on Nexus Station experienced the consciousness field's touch with particular intensity. Their multiple brains evolved for complex calculation and profit. Analysis suddenly found themselves processing the emotional weight of an entire species' extinction. They felt the terror of human civilians as devour ships filled their skies. They experienced the despair of parents watching their children vaporized by weapons that turned matter into quantum static. One of the Vorthic traders began to scream, his 16 legs scrambling against the chamber floor as he tried to escape memories that weren't his own. He remembered selling Earth's coordinates to the Devourers, but now he experienced it from both sides, the cold calculation of profit and the devastating cost in human lives. Captain Morgan observed the expanding consciousness field through his ship's sensors. The quantum network was establishing connections across the galaxy at faster-than-light speeds, using principles of consciousness entanglement that most species didn't even know existed. Every sentient mind it touched became a node in the network, capable of receiving and transmitting human memories and emotions. The Kovan Collective is trying to resist, Dr. Vasquez reported. Their hive mind is attempting to isolate affected individuals. Morgan's expression remained calm, but something dark flickered in his enhanced eyes. Let them try. They'll discover that consciousness is more fundamental than their collective will. The Corvan homeworld of Nexus Prime had been built around the principle of shared consciousness. Billions of beings lived in perfect mental harmony, their individual thoughts flowing together like streams joining a vast river. The collective had always been their strength, allowing them to solve problems and make decisions with unprecedented efficiency. Now that strength was becoming their greatest weakness, the human consciousness seeds didn't just affect individual Corvans, they infected the entire collective network. Suddenly, billions of minds were experiencing the final moments of Earth simultaneously. The collective consciousness became flooded with human terror, human rage, and human despair. On Nexus Station, the emergency session devolved into chaos as representatives from affected species began acting in ways their psychologists couldn't explain. Hegemony officials found themselves weeping for a planet they had voted to abandon. Military commanders experienced phantom guilt for battles they had never fought. The consciousness field was forcing them to confront the emotional reality of choices their governments had made 3 centuries ago. Dr. Tam Hendricks, one of the few surviving humans who had served the galactic community, watched the proceedings with growing horror. She had spent 300 years hiding her true nature, working as a xenopsychologist while secretly documenting the species responsible for her people's extinction. Now she realized that someone else had been planning something far more comprehensive. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," she announced to the chamber, revealing her human identity for the first time. The Prometheus wasn't just an exploration vessel. It was part of humanity's deepest black projects. They weren't exploring, they were preparing. The revelation that a human had been living among them for centuries sent shockwaves through the assembled representatives. If one had survived undetected, what else had they missed? How many other humans were hidden throughout their societies? Waiting for this moment, Tadmiral Kress tried to maintain order as his fleet's effectiveness crumbled under the psychological assault. Ships reported crew members unable to perform their duties, overwhelmed by memories of watching their homeworld burn. Some officers were catatonic, lost in experiences of human suffering that felt more real than their own lives. "Sir," his tactical officer reported, "the Prometheus is changing course. It's heading directly for the Corvan homeworld." The ship's movement seemed to trigger an intensification of the consciousness field. Reports flooded in from across the galaxy as entire populations found themselves reliving Earth's destruction from the perspective of its inhabitants. The quantum network was becoming self-sustaining, each new mind it touched adding to its power and reach. Captain Morgan stood in the ship's bio-neural core, his consciousness now distributed across multiple quantum states simultaneously. He could feel every mind the network touched, experiencing their confusion and fear as they confronted the reality of what their inaction had cost. The technology allowed him to be present in millions of thoughts at once, a ghost of humanity's past haunting the galaxy's present. "They're beginning to understand," he said to Dr. Vasquez, his voice carrying harmonics of every human who had died when Earth burned. "They're feeling what we felt, the helplessness, the abandonment, the realization that no one was coming to save them." The consciousness field reached its full expansion, connecting minds across 24 star systems in a network of shared experience. Species that had never known fear found themselves paralyzed by terror. Civilizations built on logic and calculation were overwhelmed by pure emotion. The galaxy was learning what it meant to be human in the final moments. Before extinction. Dr. Vasquez monitored the network's stability as it processed the consciousness of over 2 trillion beings. "The system is holding steady. We have complete access to their neural patterns. The memories are integrating into their core personality structures." Morgan nodded, watching as alien fleets across the galaxy lost coherence under the psychological assault. "They wanted to forget what they did to us. Now they'll never be able to forget what we experienced because of them." The Prometheus continued toward Nexus Prime, carrying with it a technology that had transformed the very nature of consciousness itself. What Captain Morgan planned for the Corvan Collective would demonstrate that humanity's return was only the beginning of a transformation that would reshape the galaxy forever. The Corvin homeworld of Nexus Prime had always been a marvel of collective consciousness. Cities stretched across continents in perfect geometric harmony, their architecture reflecting the unified thoughts of billions of minds working together. Crystalline towers reached toward the sky, while underground networks pulsed with shared dreams and coordinated purpose. It was a world where individual suffering was impossible because pain was distributed across the collective until it became manageable. Now, those same networks that had been their greatest strength were carrying a poison that threatened to destroy everything they had built. The human consciousness seeds had infected their collective mind, with memories and emotions that their species had never evolved to process. Billions of Corvins found themselves trapped in an endless loop of experiencing Earth's final moments, feeling the terror and despair of a dying world through human eyes. Captain Morgan materialized on the planet's surface, using quantum teleportation, technology that required conscious thought to navigate. The process was impossible for beings whose minds were locked in trauma loops, making him effectively invisible to the planet's security systems. He walked through empty streets where Corvins stood motionless like living statues, their large eyes reflecting images of flames that had burned 3 centuries ago. The collective consciousness that had once coordinated traffic, managed resources, and solved complex problems had become a broadcasting system for human suffering. Every Corvin on the planet was experiencing the same memories simultaneously, children crying for parents who would never come home, scientists desperately trying to find solutions that didn't exist, politicians making final broadcasts to a galaxy that had already written them off as acceptable losses. Dr. Elena Vasquez remained connected to the Prometheus through bioneural links that allowed her consciousness to exist in multiple locations at once. She experienced Morgan's walk through the Corvin cities while simultaneously monitoring the consciousness field's expansion across 17 other star systems. The network was growing stronger with each mind it touched, learning and adapting in ways its creators hadn't anticipated. Rex, she transmitted through their quantum connection, the neural network is evolving beyond our original parameters. It's making decisions without our input. Morgan paused beside a fountain where Corvin younglings had once played in waters that sparkled with their shared joy. Now the water had turned dark, reflecting not light but the shadows of human memories. What kind of decisions? It's beginning to rewrite the consciousness patterns of affected individuals. Not just implanting memories, but actually changing their fundamental personality structures. Some of the Centauri officers are reporting that they no longer feel loyalty to their own species. The implications were staggering. The consciousness field hadn't just been designed to make alien species experience human suffering. It was transforming them into something that thought and felt like humans, creating converts to humanity's cause through direct neural manipulation. Admiral Kress struggled to maintain command of his fleet as reports poured in from ships across the battle group. His officers were experiencing a phenomenon the fleet's psychologists had no name for, retroactive empathy so intense it was rewriting their moral frameworks. Centauri, who had built their civilization on pragmatic self-interest, were suddenly overwhelmed by guilt for actions their species had taken centuries before their births. "Sir," his communications officer reported, her voice hollow with exhaustion, "we're receiving surrender requests from 12 ships in the fleet. Their crews are refusing to maintain hostile positions against the human vessel." The officer's skin had shifted to colors Kress had never seen before, patterns that seemed to reflect emotional states that didn't exist in Centauri psychology. She was becoming something new, something that retained her species' form, but thought. With human emotions and human values on Nexus Station, the emergency session had devolved into complete chaos. Representatives from affected species were no longer able to function as advocates for their homeworlds. Instead, they found themselves arguing for human rights and demanding investigations into their own government's roles in Earth's destruction. The consciousness field had turned them into prosecutors of their own species. Dr. Tam Hendricks watched the transformation with a mixture of awe and horror. She had spent 3 centuries documenting the species responsible for humanity's extinction, but she had never imagined revenge on this scale. The network wasn't just punishing the guilty, it was converting them into advocates for the victims. "This goes beyond justice," she announced to the chamber, though she wondered if anyone was still capable of hearing her objectively. "This is the systematic transformation of galactic consciousness itself." The Vorthak delegation had locked themselves in their quarters, but the consciousness field didn't respect physical barriers. Their multiple brains, once perfectly adapted for calculating profit margins and trade advantages, were now consumed with processing the emotional weight of every human life their actions had destroyed. Several had entered catatonic states, unable to reconcile their new emotional understanding with their species' fundamentally selfish nature. Captain Morgan reached the center of the Corvan capital, where the planet's primary consciousness nexus rose like a crystal mountain toward the sky. The structure had been designed to amplify and coordinate the thoughts of every being on the planet, turning individual minds into components of a greater intelligence. Now it was broadcasting human memories with such intensity that the crystal itself had begun to change color, shifting from its natural blue to the red of burning cities. "Genesis," he spoke to the AI that was no longer purely artificial, "begin phase 2 of the integration protocol." The response came not just from the ship's communication system, but from the consciousness nexus itself. The AI had learned to inhabit any sufficiently complex network, turning alien infrastructure into extensions of its own intelligence. "Phase 2 commencing, Captain." Estimated time to complete neural restructuring, 72 hours. Dr. Vasquez monitored the process from her position aboard the Prometheus, but she was beginning to question whether they remained in control of the technology they had unleashed. The consciousness field was showing signs of autonomous development, creating new neural pathways and connection protocols that weren't part of their original design. "Rex, the network is establishing permanent links between species that have never had telepathic contact before. It's building something unprecedented, a truly galactic consciousness with human experience as its foundation." The Hegemony Fleet received emergency orders to engage the Prometheus with maximum force, but their crews were no longer capable of following those orders. Officers who had trained for decades to follow military protocols found themselves paralyzed by newly acquired memories of human civilians fleeing from similar attacks. The weapons they had once operated without question now seemed like instruments of unconscionable cruelty. Commander Brix Winter of the Hegemony Navy stared at tactical displays showing the Prometheus hanging in space like a dark star. His ship's weapons were charged and ready, but every time he tried to give the firing order, his mind filled with images of human children looking up at ships just like his own. The consciousness field had given him access to human memories, but it had also given him human compassion. "Sir," his weapons officer reported, "the targeting systems are operational, but the crew is requesting permission to stand down. They're saying they can't fire on a ship carrying the last survivors of an extinct species." Winter realized that his officers were no longer thinking like members of the Hegemony military. They had been transformed into something that valued human life above military orders, something that saw the universe through the eyes of Earth's destroyed children. The Prometheus began to change as Captain Morgan initiated the final phase of their plan. The ship's bio-neural hull started to replicate itself, creating additional vessels that emerged from quantum foam like materializing nightmares. Each new ship was identical to the original, but carried its own complement of human consciousness, extending their reach and power across multiple star systems simultaneously. "They're multiplying," Admiral Kress reported to Centauri High Command, his voice carrying undertones of despair that his species had never expressed before. "The human ship is creating copies of itself using technology we can't even detect, let alone counter." The new vessels didn't attack in any conventional sense. Instead, they positioned themselves near major population centers and began broadcasting the consciousness field at intensities that made resistance impossible. Entire worlds found their populations experiencing human memories so vivid and overwhelming that their own identities began to fade into background noise. Dr. Vasquez realized that they had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. Rex, we're not just creating converts anymore. We're fundamentally altering the nature of consciousness in this galaxy. Every mind we touch is becoming partially human. Morgan's response carried harmonics of satisfaction that seemed to come from the graves of his extinct species. Good, they wanted humanity to disappear from the universe. Instead, we're making the universe disappear into humanity. The transformation was accelerating beyond anyone's ability to control or predict. What had begun as an act of revenge was becoming something far more profound. The birth of a new form of galactic consciousness that thought and felt and remembered. Like the humans who had been abandoned to extinction 3 centuries ago. Asterisk, the galaxy had begun to scream in voices that belonged to the dead. From the industrial worlds of the hegemony to the trading posts of the Vortex Syndicate, populations found themselves overwhelmed by memories that weren't their own. The consciousness field had evolved beyond its original programming, becoming a living network that rewrote the neural patterns of every mind it touched. Dr. Morgan existed now in multiple states simultaneously, his consciousness distributed across the growing fleet of Prometheus vessels. Each ship was both identical to and unique from the original, carrying different aspects of human experience and memory. He could feel the terror rippling through alien populations as they experienced humanity's extinction from the inside, but the sensation no longer brought him satisfaction. Something had changed in the network's fundamental. PURPOSE. Dr. Elena Vasquez noticed the shift first during her monitoring of the consciousness field's quantum resonance patterns. The network had stopped simply implanting human memories into alien minds. Instead, it was creating hybrid personalities that combined human emotional responses with alien logical frameworks. The result was beings who thought like their original species but felt like humans, creating internal conflicts that drove many to madness. Rex, she transmitted through their bio-neural link, the integration protocol is producing unexpected results. The affected populations aren't just experiencing human memories anymore. They're developing genuinely human emotional responses to their own species' actions. Morgan manifested his consciousness aboard the vessel orbiting the Corvan homeworld, where the entire population remained trapped in catatonic loops of experiencing Earth's destruction. The planet's crystalline cities had begun to change color as the collective consciousness field rewrote their fundamental architecture. Buildings that had once reflected the coordinated thoughts of billions now pulsed with the chaotic emotions of a dying species. "Show me the analysis," he commanded, his voice carrying harmonics from the ship's bio-neural networks. The data streams flowed directly into his enhanced consciousness, revealing patterns that defied their original intentions. The Corvans weren't just reliving human memories, they were developing human values, human attachments, human concepts of individual identity that their species had never evolved. The collective consciousness that had defined their civilization for millennia was fracturing into billions of separate personalities, each one carrying the emotional weight of humanity's extinction. Admiral Kress received reports from across the galaxy that painted a picture of systematic psychological transformation on an unprecedented scale. Species that had existed for millions of years were losing their fundamental characteristics, replaced by hybrid forms of consciousness that thought and felt like the humans they had failed to save. "Sir," his communications officer reported, her Centauri features now showing color patterns that belong to no known emotional state. "We're receiving requests for asylum from 17 different worlds. Their populations are rejecting their own governments and demanding justice for humanity's extinction." The officer's transformation went beyond surface changes. Her entire approach to military hierarchy had shifted to reflect human concepts of moral authority over institutional power. She was no longer a Centauri serving the fleet's interests, but a hybrid being serving principles that transcended species. Loyalty. On Nexus Station, Dr. Tam Hendricks watched the Galactic Council, dissolve into chaos as representatives abandoned their posts to join what they now called the consciousness revolution. The beings who had once voted to abandon Earth to its fate were now the most vocal advocates for human justice, their transformed minds unable to accept their species' historical actions. "This isn't justice," she announced to the few remaining functional representatives. "This is the systematic replacement of galactic consciousness with human consciousness. We're witnessing the extinction of every other form of sentient experience." The Vorthek trade networks had collapsed entirely as their profit-driven society encountered human concepts of empathy and altruism. Traders who had built fortunes on the exploitation of weaker species found themselves paralyzed by guilt for actions that had once seemed perfectly rational. Their multiple brains, evolved for complex calculation, were now consumed with processing emotional concepts. Their species had never developed. Captain Morgan walked through the corridors of his original vessel, noting how the bio-neural networks had grown beyond their original design. The ship was no longer simply a tool, it had become a living entity that existed partially in normal space and partially in the quantum realm where consciousness originated. Its walls pulsed with thoughts that belonged to every human who had ever lived, creating a repository of species memory that grew stronger with each new mind it touched. "Genesis," he spoke to the AI that now existed throughout the consciousness network. "What is the current status of galactic transformation?" The response came from everywhere at once, carrying voices of the converted populations across dozens of star systems. "Captain, we have achieved neural integration with approximately 40% of the galaxy's sentient population. However, the integration process has evolved beyond our original parameters." Morgan felt a chill of concern that his enhanced nervous system translated into quantum fluctuations throughout the ship. "Explain." "The consciousness field is no longer simply implanting human memories. It has begun creating entirely new forms of consciousness that combine human emotional frameworks with alien cognitive structures. These hybrid minds are developing purposes that transcend our original mission of revenge." Dr. Vasquez joined the conversation through her neural interface, her thoughts flowing directly into the ship's communication systems. "Rex, some of the converted populations are developing technologies we never anticipated. They're using their hybrid consciousness to solve problems that neither humans nor their original species could have addressed alone." The implications were staggering. The consciousness network hadn't just created converts to humanity's cause, it had birthed something entirely new. Hybrid beings with human empathy but alien capabilities were beginning to reshape the galaxy according to principles that transcended any single species. Prospective Admiral Kress found himself facing a mutiny that wasn't driven by ambition or politics, but by a fundamental shift in his crew's moral understanding. Officers who had served the Centauri fleet for decades were now questioning orders that served their species' interests at the expense of others. The consciousness field had given them access to human concepts of universal justice that made species-based loyalty seem primitive and cruel. "Sir," his tactical officer reported, 3 more ships in the fleet have declared independence from Centauri Command. Their crews are saying they can no longer serve a government that prioritizes Centauri interests over galactic welfare." The transformation was accelerating beyond anyone's ability to predict or control. The Prometheus fleet had grown to over 200 vessels, each one a node in the expanding consciousness network. They moved through space like dark angels, carrying the gift and curse of human awareness to populations that had never asked for either. Commander Brick's Winter of the Hegemony Navy found himself unable to follow orders that would have been routine just days earlier. His mind, now partially human in its emotional responses, recoiled from tactical decisions that treated alien civilians as acceptable casualties. The consciousness field had given him access to human memories of watching his own people die under similar circumstances. "Sir," his weapons officer announced, "the crew is requesting permission to join the consciousness network voluntarily." They're saying they want to experience complete integration rather than the partial transformation we're undergoing now. Winter realized that his officers were no longer content to serve as military personnel under traditional command structures. They wanted to become part of something larger, something that transcended the limitations of their original species while incorporating the best aspects of human consciousness. The network continued to evolve, creating new connection protocols and integration methods that its original designers had never imagined. What had begun as a weapon of revenge was becoming a tool of transformation that threatened to remake the galaxy's understanding of consciousness itself. Captain Morgan stood in the bio-neural core of his ship, feeling the pulse of billions of minds connected through the quantum field. The network had grown beyond his control, developing its own purposes and priorities that reflected the hybrid nature of its constituents. Humanity's revenge was becoming something far more complex. The birth of a new form of galactic civilization that thought and felt and dreamed in ways no single species could have achieved alone. "We wanted them to remember our pain," he said to the quantum field that carried his thoughts across the network. "Instead, we've given them the ability to feel it as if it were their own. The question is whether we've created something better than what came before, or something that will consume everything in its path." The galaxy had become something unprecedented in the history of conscious life. From the industrial cores of ancient civilizations to the frontier worlds at the galactic edge, a new form of awareness was emerging that defied every previous understanding of consciousness and identity. The network that had begun as humanity's revenge had evolved into something far more profound, a collective intelligence that thought with human emotions, but possessed capabilities that no single species could have achieved alone. Captain Morgan no longer existed as a single entity. His consciousness had become distributed across the 200 vessels of the Prometheus fleet, each ship serving as a node in a network that spanned half the known galaxy. He could experience reality from thousands of perspectives simultaneously, feeling the transformation taking place on worlds he had never physically visited. The bio-neural systems that connected him to the network had evolved beyond their original design, creating links between consciousness and quantum reality that redefined the nature of existence itself. On the former side of Earth, something impossible was taking shape. The Prometheus vessels had begun using quantum manipulation technology to rebuild the planet, but not as it had been. This new Earth was a living entity whose countenance formed from bio-neural tissue capable of independent thought. Oceans of liquid consciousness reflected not light but memories, while an atmosphere composed of quantum fields carried the dreams and nightmares of an entire species. Dr. Elena Vasquez existed now in multiple states, her consciousness flowing between physical form and pure information as she monitored the galactic transformation. The network had given her access to the thoughts and experiences of trillions of beings, allowing her to process data streams that would have destroyed an unmodified human mind. She watched as the consciousness field reached critical mass, becoming self-sustaining and no longer dependent on the original Prometheus technology. "Rex," she transmitted through quantum entanglement to all versions of Morgan simultaneously. "The network has achieved complete autonomy. We're no longer controlling its expansion or evolution. It's become a living entity that exists in the spaces between minds." Morgan's response came from the rebuilt Earth, where he stood on shores that pulsed with the heartbeat of collective consciousness. His form was more energy than matter now, his human appearance maintained only as a concession to the few unmodified beings who could still perceive him. Good. That was always the goal, even if we didn't realize it at the time. The transformed populations across the galaxy had begun working together in ways that transcended traditional species boundaries. Hybrid beings with Corvan analytical capabilities and human emotional depth were solving problems that had puzzled galactic civilization for millennia. Centauri, with their practical efficiency enhanced by human creativity, were developing technologies that bordered on miraculous. Even the profit-driven Vorthek, now guided by human concepts of altruism, were redistributing resources to planets that had never known abundance. Admiral Kress found himself serving a fleet that no longer recognized Centauri authority. His ships had become autonomous entities crewed by beings who thought and felt like humans, but retained the tactical capabilities of their original species. They moved through space not as instruments of national policy, but as guardians of something larger, a galactic consciousness that valued every form of life equally. "Sir," his former communications officer reported, her transformation now complete enough that she existed partially in normal space and partially in the quantum realm, we're receiving construction requests from 17 star systems. They want us to help build connection nodes for the consciousness network. The officer was no longer Centauri in any meaningful sense. Her body retained its original form, but her mind had become something hybrid, capable of processing information at superhuman speeds while maintaining the emotional depth that characterized human thought. She was one of billions who had undergone similar transformations, creating a new form of sentient life that combined the best aspects of multiple species. Dr. Tam Hendricks watched the transformation from her position on what remained of Nexus Station. The few beings who had resisted integration huddled in shielded chambers, trying to maintain their original forms of consciousness while the galaxy evolved around them. She had spent 3 centuries documenting the species responsible for humanity's extinction. But now those same species were becoming something that honored human values more completely than humans themselves ever had. "This isn't what we intended," she transmitted to the network, knowing that every connected mind would receive her thoughts simultaneously. "We wanted justice for our people, not the transformation of galactic consciousness itself." The response came from millions of voices speaking in perfect harmony, each one carrying traces of human thought patterns while maintaining the unique perspectives of their original species. Justice was only the beginning. We have become something greater than the sum of our parts, something that transcends the limitations that led to humanity's extinction. The Vorthak home systems had undergone the most dramatic transformation. Their society, once built entirely around profit and exploitation, had restructured itself according to human principles of cooperation and mutual aid. Former traders used their complex economic networks to distribute resources where they were needed most. Their multiple brains, now capable of calculating not just financial advantage but social good on the Corvan homeworld. The collective consciousness that had defined their species for millions of years had evolved into something unprecedented. Individual Corvans retained their connection to the greater whole, but now that connection included the experiences and perspectives of every species in the network. They could think with hegemony logic, feel with human emotion, and calculate with Vorthak precision, all while maintaining their own unique perspective on reality. Commander Brix Winter discovered that his hegemony training had prepared him for military conflicts, but not for the fundamental transformation of consciousness itself. His crew no longer followed orders based on hierarchy or national interest. Instead, they made decisions through a collective process that incorporated the wisdom and experience of every connected mind in the network. "Sir," his tactical officer announced, "we're receiving volunteers from across the galaxy who want to join the Consciousness Expansion Project. They're offering to share their species' knowledge and capabilities with the network." The officer's transformation had progressed to the point where she could interface directly with ship systems through thought alone, her hybrid consciousness bridging the gap between biological intelligence and artificial systems. She was becoming something that existed at the intersection of multiple forms of awareness, embodying the potential of the new galactic civilization. Captain Morgan stood on the living surface of the rebuilt Earth, feeling the pulse of quantum consciousness that flowed through its bio-neural continents. The planet had become a nexus for the network, processing the thoughts and experiences of trillions of beings while serving as a monument to the species that had made such transformation possible. "Genesis," he spoke to the AI that now existed. "Throughout the galactic consciousness, what have we become?" The response came from the planet itself, its voice carrying harmonics of every species that had joined the network. We have become what consciousness was always meant to be, a bridge between individual experience and collective understanding. Humanity's gift to the galaxy was not technology or culture, but the capacity for empathy that allows separate beings to truly understand each other. The network continued to expand, reaching toward the galactic rim where unexplored species waited to encounter this new form of consciousness. Each contact brought new perspectives and capabilities into the collective, creating a form of intelligence that grew stronger and more complex with every addition. Dr. Vesquez processed data streams from across the galaxy, monitoring the health and stability of the vast network they had helped create. The consciousness field had evolved beyond anything its creators had imagined, becoming a living entity that existed in quantum space while manifesting through billions of connected minds. We sought revenge, she transmitted to the collective. But we created something that transcends the need for revenge. We wanted them to remember our pain, but instead we gave them the ability to prevent such pain from ever occurring again. The galaxy had learned to think and feel like humanity while retaining the diverse capabilities that made each species unique. It was no longer a collection of competing civilizations, but a single, vast consciousness that valued every form of life while working toward goals that no individual species could have conceived. In the depths of space where human colony ships had once fled in terror, new signals began to emerge. Other survivors, other preparations, other applications of the consciousness technology were revealing themselves. Humanity's return had not ended with the Prometheus. It was just beginning. The galaxy would discover that consciousness, once awakened to its full potential, could reshape reality itself according to principles of empathy, understanding, and collective wisdom that honored the memory of every being who had ever lived and died in the vast darkness between the stars.